Here's what happened to Cesaro, and it was both a blessing and a curse for him. When I was paired with Cesaro, Brock Lesnar had just beaten the streak the night before.
He makes me sick. That is what more than one wrestler has said about Paul Heyman, after the cameras stopped rolling and the deal was already done. Heyman is one of the smartest men to ever pick up a microphone in professional wrestling. He can make a nobody feel like a chosen one in 30 seconds flat. He can talk a crowd into booing a hero or cheering a monster. People call him a genius, and they are right to. But being brilliant and being loyal are two very different things. Tonight, we are counting down 10 wrestlers who found that out the hard way. 10 wrestlers who trusted Paul Heyman, who believed in him, who thought they finally had someone in their corner. And 10 wrestlers who eventually learned that Heyman's corner belongs to whoever is most useful to him at that exact moment. This is not a story about a man who hated these wrestlers. That would almost be simpler. Hate is personal. What we are about to walk through is something colder than hate. It is about a man who could like you, respect you, even believe in your talent, and still let you go the second something bigger came along. Brock Lesnar, CM Punk, Vince McMahon's approval, ECW's survival. Whatever mattered more than you. So here is the question we are going to answer, one wrestler at a time. Was becoming a Paul Heyman guy really the blessing it looked like on television? Or was it something closer to a loan, one that Heyman could call in whenever he needed to? Let's count them down. Number 10, all the way to number 1, and by the end, you will understand exactly why some of these men still have not forgiven him. Think about what it actually meant to be called a Paul Heyman guy on live television. For years, that phrase was treated like a golden ticket. Heyman is one of the greatest talkers this business has ever produced, and when he stood next to you and told the world you mattered, people believed him, because Heyman has spent decades proving he knows exactly who is going to matter next. He helped turn Brock Lesnar into the most dominant attraction in the sport. He helped turn Steve Austin into a household name. He helped CM Punk deliver some of the most talked about promos in modern wrestling history. None of that is in dispute. The man can build a star. But building a star and protecting a person are two completely different jobs. And this list exists because Heyman kept choosing one over the other. Every single wrestler on this list got a taste of what it felt like to matter to Paul Heyman. Every single one of them eventually learned what happens when they stopped mattering. Sometimes it was slow, a gradual fade into the background of a card they used to headline. Sometimes it was sudden, a phone call, a release, a lie told straight to a friend's face. Either way, the pattern holds. When the pressure got heavy enough, when ECW's finances were collapsing, or Brock Lesnar needed the spotlight, or CM Punk needed a body to feed to, or Vince McMahon needed a budget cut, Heyman consistently chose the bigger priority over the wrestler standing right in front of him. That is not the same thing as being cruel for no reason. It might actually be something more unsettling than cruelty. It is a kind of cold, clear-headed math, running quietly underneath one of the most charismatic personalities the wrestling business has ever seen. Number 10 on our list is John Heidenreich. In 2004, Heidenreich showed up on SmackDown with a strange new gimmick. He recited poetry before his matches. He looked unhinged. And standing right next to him, giving him instant credibility, was Paul Heyman. Heyman's voice was even worked into Heidenreich's entrance music, so that every single week, fans heard Heyman's endorsement before Heidenreich even walked through the curtain. That kind of attention does not happen by accident. WWE needed a monster. The Undertaker needed an opponent for a program that would keep him occupied for a while. Heyman needed a reason to stay relevant on weekly television. Heidenreich needed all of that, badly, because without Heyman's backing, he was just another big man with nothing to separate him from the pack. For a few months, it worked. Heidenreich felt like a real threat. He got a program with The Undertaker himself, one of the biggest names in the history of the company. But the feud was built to end one way, and it did. Heidenreich lost a casket match. Once that match was over, so was his usefulness. There was no next step, no follow-up storyline, no effort to turn that momentum into something lasting. Heyman had needed a monster for a specific window of time, and once that window closed, Heidenreich was left standing there, poetry and all, with nowhere to go. He would bounce around the roster for a while longer before his release, but the version of Heidenreich that mattered, the one Heyman built, was already gone the moment The Undertaker's hand was raised. Think about how deliberate that entrance music decision really was. WWE does not casually decide to put a manager's actual voice into a wrestler's theme song. That was a signal to the audience, a way of saying, pay attention, this man is protected, this man is dangerous, because Paul Heyman says he is dangerous. For a performer who had struggled to find a real identity before that pairing, hearing that endorsement every single week must have felt like validation. It must have felt like Hayman finally saw something in him worth building around. And for a little while, that belief was rewarded with a real spot on the card and a program against one of the most respected performers in wrestling history. But that is exactly the pattern we are going to see over and over again on this list. Hayman was not building Heidenreich's career. He was borrowing Heidenreich's body for a specific storyline function, and once that function was complete, there was no second act waiting for him, no slow burn toward the main event, no creative investment beyond the immediate need. Just silence and a quiet fade toward the exit. Number 9 is Matt Morgan. In 2003, Matt Morgan looked like the future. 7 feet tall, athletic, with a background in college basketball, he was exactly the kind of physical specimen that WWE loves to build around. Paul Heyman, who was running SmackDown's creative direction and appearing on screen as general manager, personally introduced him to the world. He told the audience that just like Brock Lesnar had been the next big thing, Matt Morgan would assert his dominance on every single athlete who stood in front of him. That is not a small endorsement. That is Heyman putting his own credibility behind a brand new star, comparing him directly to the man who had just legitimized modern WWE. Morgan was placed in Team Lesnar for Survivor Series that year, standing alongside other imposing big men. For a moment, it felt like Heyman was building something real, but look closer, and the truth becomes obvious. Heyman's actual priority was never Matt Morgan, it was Brock Lesnar. Morgan was there to add size and spectacle to a match that was really about protecting Lesnar's aura. Once Survivor Series ended, Morgan had no program, no direction, and no advocate pushing hard for his next chapter. Then came the cruelest twist of all. When Morgan returned to television in 2005, he was given a stuttering gimmick. According to the reporting on this, Vince McMahon had originally wanted to give that exact gimmick to Brock Lesnar himself, hoping to give the dominant monster a strange verbal flaw to contrast his physical perfection. When that idea was rightly killed to protect Lesnar's image, it did not disappear. It was handed to Matt Morgan instead. Here is what makes it so hard to swallow. Morgan actually held a college degree in public speaking. The gimmick attacked the exact area where his real-life education said he should have been strong. Heyman had the creative standing to push back on an idea like that. He did not. He let it happen. Morgan's first WWE run ended after only 14 matches. The blueprint, as they called him, never got the chance to become anything more than an idea that Heyman abandoned once Brock Lesnar's story moved on without him. Number 8 is the Sandman. Before WWE, before Brock Lesnar, before any of the names on this list, there was ECW, and there was the Sandman. 5 times ECW World Heavyweight Champion, a beer-drinking, cane-swinging embodiment of everything the promotion stood for. He was in the ring for some of the most controversial angles in wrestling history, moments so extreme that Olympic gold medalist Kurt Angle reportedly threatened legal action over one of them. The Sandman was not a side character in ECW. He was one of the pillars holding the whole promotion up. But behind that rebellious image was a company drowning in debt. Paychecks bounced, wages went unpaid for stretches at a time, and the man in charge of the promotion, Paul Heyman, kept telling his locker room that better days were right around the corner. He denied over and over that WWE's Vince McMahon was secretly propping up ECW with cash. That denial turned out to be false. McMahon really was funding ECW behind the scenes, including a $500,000 loan just to help the company put on one of its pay-per-view events. Heyman knew the truth, his locker room did not. Here is the part that stings the most. The talent kept showing up. They kept bleeding for ECW, kept believing in the brand, kept trusting that the checks would eventually clear. That loyalty was not just appreciated by Hayman, it was relied upon. It became something close to a financial resource in its own right, because as long as wrestlers like the Sandman believed in the mission, Hayman did not need to have the money in hand. He just needed them to keep showing up. That is not a story about simple unpaid wages. That is a story about turning genuine belief into a business strategy. Picture what it must have been like inside that locker room. Paychecks bouncing was not a rare, one-time embarrassment. It was a recurring reality that wrestlers like the Sandman simply learned to live with, because Hayman had built a culture where staying loyal to ECW felt like standing against the entire wrestling establishment together. That us-against-the-world mentality was genuinely powerful. It made ECW feel like a movement, not just a promotion. But movements still need money to survive, and when the money ran out, it was Heyman's communication skills, not his bank account, that kept the roster showing up night after night. The Sandman was not some replaceable undercard name. He was a 5-time champion, a figure whose image was plastered across ECW's marketing, a wrestler who put his body on the line in some of the most extreme angles the company ever produced. That level of investment deserved honesty in return. Instead, he got denials about where the company's money was actually coming from, denials that we now know were false. Vince McMahon really was quietly funding ECW behind the scenes while Heyman was telling his own locker room the opposite. The Sandman kept showing up anyway, because that is exactly what loyalty is supposed to look like. Heyman understood that, and he leaned on it. Number 7 is Cedric Alexander. Fast forward to 2019. Paul Heyman is no longer just a manager or a promo machine. He is the executive director of Monday Night Raw, reporting straight to Vince McMahon, with real power over the creative direction of the show. One of his early projects was Cedric Alexander. Heyman saw real athletic talent in him and started building him up, giving him a win over Drew McIntyre and competitive matches against established stars in the King of the Ring tournament. For a little while, it looked like Alexander had found the kind of backstage advocate that can make or break a career. Then, by September of 2019, Vince McMahon simply lost interest. According to reporting from the time, McMahon wanted Alexander buried, and that decision showed up on screen at the Clash of Champions event, where Alexander suffered a fast, decisive loss to AJ Styles. Publicly, Alexander did not complain. He called losing to Styles an honor, and praised Heyman for helping him grow as a performer. That is a classy response, but it does not change what actually happened behind the scenes. Heyman held the title of executive director. He had real authority. And when McMahon decided to pull the plug on Alexander's push, Heyman did not spend his political capital fighting for him. This is important, because the story here is not that Heyman personally ordered Alexander to be buried. The story is quieter and, in some ways, more troubling than that. Heyman had power and chose not to use it to protect someone he had personally invested in. Silence, when you have the authority to speak up, is its own kind of decision. There is something almost heartbreaking about how Cedric Alexander handled his own burial. He did not lash out publicly. He did not accuse Heyman of anything. He praised him, genuinely, for making him a better performer, for sharpening his instincts and his in-ring psychology. That kind of reaction only makes sense if Alexander truly believed Heyman had his best interests at heart. And maybe, in some limited sense, Heyman did. The problem was never a lack of belief in Alexander's ability. The problem was what happened the moment that belief collided with Vince McMahon's authority. Heyman had just been handed one of the most powerful creative positions in the entire company. Executive Director of Raw is not a symbolic title. It comes with real influence over which stories get told and which performers get opportunities. When McMahon decided Alexander was no longer worth pushing, Heyman was in a position to at least make the case for him. Instead, according to the reporting, he let the decision stand, protecting his own larger agenda, including the pushes he cared more about, rather than spending his political capital on a talent he had personally discovered. Number 6 is Ryback. By the fall of 2013, Ryback was in trouble. He had lost a string of high-profile matches to John Cena, Mark Henry, and Daniel Bryan, and his monster aura was starting to crack. Pairing up with Paul Heyman looked like the perfect fix. Heyman had a track record of making broken characters feel dangerous again, and Ryback needed exactly that. He became Heyman's enforcer during the CM Punk storyline, a physical threat meant to protect Heyman and punish Punk on his behalf. What Ryback found behind the curtain was very different from what the fans saw on screen. Heyman and CM Punk were extremely close friends in real life, and according to Ryback's own later comments, the two of them would spend hours together shaping the direction of the story, while Ryback sat outside that process entirely. He has described trying to explain his frustrations to Heyman for hours at a time, only to watch Heyman's real creative loyalty stay locked onto Punk. Ryback was supposed to be at the center of this feud. Instead, he was generating heat for Heyman and sympathy for Punk, without much say in his own storyline. Once Punk beat him at 2 consecutive pay-per-views, Battleground and then Hell in a Cell, the entire partnership ended almost overnight. There was no next chapter for Ryback, no transition, no effort to keep his momentum alive. He had done exactly what was asked of him, and once that job was finished, Heyman moved on without him. What stands out most about Ryback's version of events is the sheer amount of effort he put into trying to make the partnership work. This was not a wrestler who quietly accepted being sidelined. He has talked about spending hours in conversation with Heyman, trying to advocate for his own character, trying to be heard in a creative process that was clearly happening without him. Imagine being the physical centerpiece of a major feud, the man taking the bumps and absorbing the punishment every single week, while the two people actually shaping the direction of that story sit somewhere else entirely, working it out between themselves. That is the real sting of the Ryback story. It was not just that the partnership ended, it was that Ryback was never really inside it to begin with. He was positioned as Heyman's enforcer, the muscle standing guard, but the creative trust Hayman reserved for CM Punk was never extended to him. Once Punk had beaten him twice on the big stage, there was nothing left for Ryback to offer the story, and the door closed behind him almost instantly. Number 5 is Curtis Axel. Curtis Axel, the son of WWE Hall of Famer Mr. Perfect, had been stuck under the deeply unpopular name Michael McGillicuddy, going nowhere on the roster. Then in May of 2013, Hayman rebranded him as the newest Paul Heyman guy. Almost overnight, Axel started winning matches. He captured the Intercontinental Championship. From the outside, it looked exactly like what everyone hopes for. A struggling talent, rescued by a legendary manager, finally getting his real shot. But Hayman later admitted the truth in interviews, and it is a hard thing to hear if you were rooting for Axel. There was never a real plan to take him to the top of the card. His entire purpose was to give CM Punk someone to beat on the way to the bigger picture. Hayman has said in his own words that Axel filled the need for bodies around him to feed to Punk, and that almost any other masked character could have played the same role. When Hayman first asked Vince McMahon what the real plan for Axel was, McMahon told him it was going all the way to the top. Hayman, with all his experience reading backstage politics, understood immediately that this was not true. Axel believed in the push. He believed Hayman was building him into something permanent. He performed his role well, took his losses to Punk on schedule, and helped the bigger story land. Then, once Punk's storyline moved past him, Axel lost the Intercontinental Championship and lost Heyman's spotlight along with it. He never had the backstage standing to fight for himself. Once that protection disappeared, the push had looked personal. It was actually just functional. There is a particular kind of cruelty in how casually Hayman has described this arrangement after the fact. He has said, plainly, that he could have put a mask on Axel and called him almost anything else, the Mad Russian, an assassin, a nameless destroyer, and the storyline function would have been exactly the same. That is a stunning thing to admit about a wrestler who genuinely believed he had found a mentor. Axel was the son of a WWE Hall of Famer, someone who understood the business from the inside, and even he could not see through the illusion until it was already over. Being handed the Intercontinental Championship is not a small thing. It is a real title, with real history, and for a few months it made Axel's push feel legitimate in a way that went beyond just standing next to Hayman on television. But a championship can be a costume just as easily as it can be a genuine building block, and in this case, it was closer to the former. Once CM Punk's story had used him up, the title changed hands. The spotlight moved on, and Axel was left to figure out how to matter again, without the voice that had made him feel important in the first place. Number 4 is Rob Van Dam. Rob Van Dam was arguably the single most popular star ECW ever created, a man who held the ECW television championship for nearly 2 years and represented everything cutting-edge about the promotion. When ECW finally collapsed in 2001, Heyman's company, HHG Corp., owed Van Dam $150,000 in unpaid wages. The bankruptcy filings tell the rest of the story. HHG Corp. reported roughly $1.4 million in total assets, against a mountain of debt that dwarfed it. Van Dam was owed just as much as fellow ECW star Tommy Dreamer was owed $100,000, and there was still more owed to production companies, and even to the state of New York in unpaid taxes. Van Dam has been blunt about how he sees Heyman's role in all of this, describing him as someone who lied constantly about the company's finances, and pointing out that the longer he stayed loyal to ECW, the deeper the financial hole he dug for himself. That is a serious accusation, and it is backed up by real numbers in the bankruptcy documents. But here is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. Under bankruptcy law, any payments made to creditors within 90 days before an official bankruptcy filing can potentially be clawed back by the court. Hayman appears to have understood this, because he waited a full 90 days after ECW shut down before officially filing for bankruptcy. That delay meant that any money he had already managed to pay certain wrestlers in those final months could not legally be seized afterward. In other words, while Hayman was deceiving his locker room about the company's true financial health, he may have simultaneously been protecting some of the money they had already received. He could not explain this strategy to the roster without tipping off creditors, so from Van Dam's side, all he saw was Hayman quietly appearing on WWE television as a commentator while ECW was still dying behind the scenes. Deception and protection, tangled together in the same decision. That contradiction is exactly why this case is so hard to simplify into a single villain story. Try to sit with how confusing that must have felt from Van Damme's side of things. One day, ECW simply stops operating. There is no clear explanation, no honest accounting of where the money went, or why the promises of a turnaround never materialized. Hayman, the man who had spent years assuring everyone that better days were coming, shows up on WWE television not long after, while the company he ran is still legally unraveling behind the scenes. From the outside, that looks like abandonment, plain and simple. But the 90-day waiting period tells a more complicated story underneath all of that. Hayman was not just walking away and moving on to a new opportunity. He appears to have been running out the clock on a specific legal window, making sure that whatever payments he had already managed to get out to wrestlers like Van Damme could not be legally reclaimed by creditors once the bankruptcy officially began. That is not the behavior of someone who simply stopped caring. It is the behavior of someone playing a much longer, much quieter game, one he could not explain to the people it was meant to protect, without risking the whole plan. Van Damme was still owed $150,000 either way. The debt was real. The frustration was earned. But the full picture is messier than a simple story of a promoter who lied and vanished. Number 3 is Cesaro. If there is one entry on this list that best captures the entire pattern, it is this one. At WrestleMania 30 in 2014, Cesaro had one of the biggest nights of his career, winning the first ever Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal in front of a roaring crowd. The very next night, in a moment built for maximum excitement, Cesaro turned his back on his old manager Zeb Coulter and declared himself a Paul Heyman guy. To the fans, and to Cesaro himself, this felt like the ultimate cosign. It felt like Cesaro was finally being handed the keys to the main event scene. The real reason behind the pairing had almost nothing to do with Cesaro. The night before that segment, Brock Lesnar had shockingly ended The Undertaker's legendary undefeated streak at WrestleMania. Lesnar worked a limited schedule and was about to disappear from television for months. WWE needed a way to keep reminding the audience of what he had done, and Heyman needed to be positioned physically in a wrestling ring, not just at the commentary desk, to sell that message properly. Heyman has since openly admitted that Cesaro was, in his own words, an excuse to get Heyman on television. Week after week, Heyman would stand next to Cesaro and spend almost all of his promo time talking about the absent Brock Lesnar. Fans wanted to cheer Cesaro's incredible athleticism. Instead, they were stuck booing Heyman's bragging about a man who was not even there. Heyman has said that by the third week of this pairing, he already knew Cesaro was going to be discarded the moment Lesnar came back to television. He knew it, and he continued anyway. Cesaro was never being trusted to carry Heyman's message. He was simply holding space for Brock Lesnar's story until Lesnar was ready to return. Heyman has since called the entire handling of Cesaro a major fumble and has taken accountability for wasting what he has described as generational talent. That admission does not undo what happened. It confirms it. Think about how rare it is for a wrestler to get the kind of organic reaction Cesaro earned that WrestleMania weekend. That was not a reaction WWE manufactured through a big video package or a scripted moment. Fans simply decided, on their own, that they loved watching him work, and an entire section of the arena started chanting his name every single week afterward. That kind of connection with an audience is exactly what promoters spend years trying to manufacture, and almost never can. Cesaro had it, naturally, and it arrived at the exact moment Heyman needed a warm body standing next to him in a wrestling ring. The tragedy is that Heyman knew what he had. He has openly credited John Cena, the biggest star in the company at the time, with pushing behind the scenes for Cesaro to be built into a genuine main event player. Heyman did not fight for that outcome. He used Cesaro's momentum to serve a completely different agenda, one built entirely around keeping Brock Lesnar's WrestleMania achievement fresh in the audience's mind during Lesnar's months-long absence from television. By his own admission, Heyman understood within 3 weeks that the entire pairing was temporary, a countdown clock running toward the moment Lesnar returned, and Cesaro would no longer be needed. He kept going anyway, week after week, using a wrestler's real career potential as a placeholder for someone else's spotlight. Number 2 is Karl Anderson. In 2019, Karl Anderson and his tag team partner Luke Gallows were seriously courted by the newly formed All Elite Wrestling. It was a real threat, and WWE knew it. Executives, including Triple H, pushed hard to keep them in the company, reportedly stressing the financial security WWE could offer their families and warning them that this new promotion might not even survive. Convinced by those arguments, Anderson and Gallows signed new, lucrative contract extensions to stay. Less than a year later, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, WWE conducted a wave of talent releases to protect profit margins, even though the company was still bringing in massive guaranteed money from its television deals. Karl Anderson was one of the names cut. For a wrestler who had just turned down a competing offer, specifically because he trusted WWE's promises, this was as personal a betrayal as it gets, even if the decision itself was framed as pure business. Think about the position Anderson was actually in during 2019. A brand new promotion was offering him real opportunities, a fresh start, a chance to be part of something being built from the ground up. Instead, he listened to the people already in power, people including Triple H, telling him that stability mattered more than opportunity, that WWE could offer his family something a startup company could not guarantee. That is a completely reasonable thing to weigh, and Anderson made the reasonable choice. He bet on loyalty. He bet on the company that had already invested in him. Less than a year later, that bet did not matter at all. WWE was still profitable. The company was not desperate the way ECW once was. This was not a promotion fighting for survival. It was a business decision made during a pandemic to protect margins that were already healthy, and Karl Anderson's name ended up on that list anyway, despite the promises that had convinced him to stay in the first place. Number 1 is Luke Gallows. If Karl Anderson's release was the wound, Luke Gallows is where we see exactly how deep it went, and who was really behind it. Behind the scenes, their stablemate AJ Styles was devastated by the news. According to Styles, Paul Heyman personally pulled him aside and denied having any involvement whatsoever, insisting that if he had known Gallows and Anderson were on the chopping block, he would have fought to keep them. Gallows has since recalled an earlier moment when Hayman looked him directly in the eye and said that if he ever lied to him, Gallows should go on social media and destroy his reputation, because he wanted the locker room to know that he could always be trusted. Then Styles went straight to Vince McMahon and asked him directly whether Hayman was responsible for the firings. According to Styles, McMahon confirmed that Gallows and Anderson were not originally on his own list of cuts, and told him plainly that their release was, in his words, a Hayman thing. The reporting suggests Hayman had actually pushed for their termination in creative meetings, arguing that they were being paid too much for their spot on the card, and that he had no real plans to use them going forward. This is important to say clearly, because it is easy to let the anger take over here. The decision itself, cutting 2 wrestlers to manage a budget, is the kind of cold business call that happens across the entire wrestling industry. What makes this case the worst one on our list is not the release itself, it is what happened right after. Hayman had the chance to simply own that decision. Instead, he looked Gallows and Anderson's closest friend in the eye and lied about it. Styles later called Hayman a bold-faced liar to his face, and asked to be moved off of Raw entirely just to avoid working under him. Hayman was removed from his executive director position only a few weeks later, and his attempt to protect himself by hiding the truth ultimately failed anyway. Sit with that quote for a second, the one where Hayman told Gallows to go on social media and destroy him if he ever lied. Gallows did not make that up out of nowhere. He remembered it clearly enough to repeat it afterward, word for word, because it meant something to him at the time. It was Hayman staking his own reputation on the idea of trust, telling a wrestler directly that honesty was the one thing he would never compromise on. That kind of promise carries real weight when it comes from a man who has spent his entire career reading people, understanding exactly what words will land and why. And that is precisely what makes the follow-up so damaging. This was not a case of Hayman staying quiet the way he did with Cedric Alexander, letting a decision happen without objecting. This was active. According to the reporting, he sat AJ Styles down and specifically denied any involvement, even as evidence pointed the other way. When Vince McMahon himself confirmed to Styles that the release traced back to Hayman, it did not just confirm a business decision. It confirmed that the promise Hayman had made to Gallows, the one about never lying, had been broken in the most direct way possible, to the very people who trusted him most. So here we are, at the end of the countdown, and it is worth stepping back to ask what all 10 of these stories actually add up to. Across every era of Paul Heyman's career, in ECW's collapsing finances, in Brock Lesnar's shadow, in CM Punk's storyline, and in the corporate boardrooms of 2019, the same basic pattern keeps repeating itself. Heyman's loyalty is not random, it is hierarchical. There is always something at the very top of his priority list, something he will protect no matter what it costs everyone else around it. In ECW, that top priority was the survival of the promotion itself. In WWE, it has usually been Brock Lesnar, or CM Punk's storyline, or simply staying in Vince McMahon's good graces. Everyone else on this list was, at some point, treated as scaffolding, built to support that one bigger priority. Once the scaffolding was no longer needed, it came down. That is also why becoming a Paul Heyman guy can be so misleading. On television, it looks like the biggest endorsement in the business. Heyman's voice alone can make an audience believe in someone instantly. Axel and Heidenreich both got that instant credibility. But an endorsement on screen is not the same thing as protection behind the scenes. Hayman rarely spent his real backstage influence keeping these pushes alive once his attention shifted elsewhere. The rub was real in the moment, it just was not built to last. Then there is Vince McMahon, hanging over almost every single one of these stories. Matt Morgan's stuttering gimmick came from McMahon. Cedric Alexander's sudden burial came from McMahon. The decision to cut Gallows and Anderson traced straight back to a boardroom where McMahon held the final word. Hayman knew, at every point in his WWE career, that he served at McMahon's pleasure. Fighting too hard against McMahon's decisions could end his own position instantly. So again and again, Hayman chose to comply rather than resist, protecting his own seat at the table even when it meant sacrificing the wrestlers standing right next to him. And running underneath all of it is Hayman's complicated relationship with the truth itself. With the Sandman and Rob Van Dam, he lied about ECW's finances to keep them working, while at the very same time quietly using the bankruptcy process to protect some of the money they had already earned. With Gallows and Anderson, he denied any involvement directly to their faces, even after reportedly pushing for their release behind closed doors. 10 different wrestlers, 3 different decades, 3 completely different eras of the business, from smoky independent arenas to the biggest stage professional wrestling has ever produced. And underneath all of it, one man, brilliant enough to build every single one of them up, and calculating enough to let every single one of them go the moment something bigger came along. That is the real story behind Paul Heyman's legacy. Not a man who hated the people he worked with. A man who simply never let loyalty outrank survival. Which one of these 10 hit you the hardest? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the business behind the business of professional wrestling, make sure you are subscribed.